and you never know it as he floats in the air.
Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About the Middle East. I'm Andy Blanche.
And I'm Juliana Musheyev, and John Dickman is here helping us with the show today.
On this show, we talk about the Middle East, its culture, politics, religion, history, just about anything that captures the complexity of the region.
We hope to promote open and honest discussion about the conflict in Israel and Palestine and to humanize the conflict by getting to know the people who have a stake in the issues. You're listening to WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton. The opinions and views expressed on Let's Talk About the Middle East are strictly those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the station manager, the board of directors, or anyone else affiliated with WSLR.
Manatee Pride announces its third annual Pride Festival to benefit the PRISM Youth Initiative, a support organization for LGBT youth in Manatee County. The festival will take place in Bradenton's Riverwalk Park on Saturday, March 19th from noon till 5 p.m. There will be music, drag queens, vendors, and food all day. Information is available at www.manateepride.com.
Great. Today we'll be interviewing Aaron Ellis. It seems like the loudest and most influential Jewish voices in the media and in national and international discourse tend to be pro-Israel and center the experience of Jews and Israelis while ignoring the experiences of Palestinian people. These voices reflect a strong relationship between the State of Israel and how people define their Jewish identity. We wanted to speak to someone that represents the large population of Jews in the United States who fight for Palestinian rights and denounce the policies of the State of Israel, Jewish activist and member of Jewish Voice for Peace, Aaron Ellis. Aaron Ellis is a PhD student in theater studies at Florida State University, as well as being a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. He is the co-president of FSU's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. Thank you so much for being with us today, Aaron.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, Aaron, you've been to Israel and the territories several times. You went to Israel on birthright, a free trip offered to all young Jews aged 18 to 26, and you went to Palestine in your capacity as an activist. Can you tell us about these contrasting experiences and how they influenced your perspective?
Sure. When I first went to the so-called Holy Land there, I thought that I knew more or less what I would see, but what I saw when I got there really surprised me. It showed me that it was a lot worse than I had thought, and gave me a real feeling of culpability as a Jew and also as an American. You know, the State of Israel being, of course, a quote-unquote Jewish state, and their military occupation, of course, being subsidized by American tax dollars. So, as far as the contrasting experiences that I had visiting, let's say, Tel Aviv or even West Jerusalem versus being in East Jerusalem and other places in the occupied territory, it's just striking how Israelis live with ease and freedom of movement, access to resources, and what I would generally qualify as a normal Western life. Except for example, these homes are under constant threat of being demolished, who have trouble accessing basic resources like water, like education, like healthcare, and also lack basic freedoms of movement. I mean, for a Palestinian to go from one city in the occupied territories to another can be impossible for days at a time. Or it could just be arduous and they'd be redirected to walk miles out of their way in order to reach someplace just on the other side of the checkpoint. So the difference between the two places is quite striking in the power differential and in the differential of quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on to your own personal identity, how would you describe your Jewish identity and what it means for you to be Jewish?
Okay. Well, people, I think, perhaps people generally think of religiosity in terms of, whether or not you go to the holy places, whether or not you go to temple, whether or not you say prayers, whether or not you keep kosher. For me, those are not what are important about my Jewish identity. I take my Jewish identity to be firmly rooted in the call to protect the widow, the stranger, the orphan. The sort of ethical core of the Jewish tradition, articulated quite beautifully by the prophets, for example, is really what is at the heart of what it means for me to be Jewish. So my Judaism really only impacts like what I eat, for example. If the tomatoes that come from the Immokalee are being sold at Publix, I don't eat it. This for me is a religious obligation as much as it is a humanitarian obligation.
So it sounds like your Jewish identity, how you think about yourself as a Jew, is related directly to your activism. Would you say that was the case?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, as much as possible, I try to let that thread of my Judaism run through my entire life, so that it's not only when I'm, at a rally, it's not only when I'm, speaking on a show like this about Palestinian human rights and their suffering. I try to, incorporate that sensibility and sensitivity in my daily life. But of course, it's a struggle, and so we do what we can.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like you get strength from that.
It's hard for me to say exactly where the strength comes from, but there's a certain, I don't know how to say it, there's a certain beauty that I find in the struggle that I engage in, even though it's, like I said, a struggle, and it's hard, and it's not always easy, and it's not always rewarding, and it can sometimes feel like an impossible task. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's not up to us to complete the task, it's up to us to pursue it, right? We don't have to complete it, but neither can we abandon it.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And can you tell us about Jewish Voice for Peace? What do they represent, and how did you get involved with them, and why did you choose to get involved with that particular group?
Sure. Jewish Voice for Peace and what they represent. Mm-hmm. Well, Jewish Voice for Peace represents, I think, a place and space for Jews of all different types, all different ethnic or racial backgrounds, all different denominational backgrounds, even those who don't want to have anything to do with institutional Judaism. They provide a space for all those who've been marginalized from the mainstream Jewish establishment, and primarily those who've been marginalized from mainstream Jewish establishment and communities because they're critical of Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So Jewish Voice for Peace is a great gathering place for those Jews that have been marginalized and disenfranchised from Jewish community. Mm-hmm. And they also take it as their sort of, I guess like me, take it as their Jewish, something having to do with their Jewish responsibility in the world to speak truth to Israeli power and to advocate for the human and civil rights of Palestinians, both in the occupied territories and in within the state of Israel. They also show solidarity with other struggles for people of color here in the United States, for LGBTQ plus people here in the United States and all around the world. But their central concern is that and my central concern is that Jewish identity in the 20th century has been co-opted by a political state that Jewish suffering in the 20th century and beyond has been co-opted by an oppressive state. Mm-hmm. And the state claims to speak on behalf of Jews. It claims to be a place for Jews. Jewish Voice for Peace and myself, and really, Jews all over the world, are increasingly standing up and saying, not in my name, not on behalf of my history.
It seems like a reclaiming of the Jewish identity as something, that is righteous and not associated necessarily with what you call institutional Judaism.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I want to move on to BDS. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is an international movement meant to put economic pressure on the State of Israel to end the occupation. And it has been gaining momentum nationally and internationally. Several academic associations and other institutions have passed resolutions to boycott Israeli products or corporations that benefit the occupation of Palestinian territories. And as a backlash to this, Western governments have begun criminalizing BDS. Their justification is that the BDS movement is anti-Semitic. What is your position on BDS?
Well, first of all, it's not anti-Semitic in and of itself. When it comes to criticism of the State of Israel, BDS or otherwise, there may be people who criticize the State of Israel or engage in BDS who are anti-Semitic, and that is their reason for doing so. I personally, since 2005, I've been engaged in this very actively, and I have never once met a person that I felt was anti-Semitic. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist. But the question is about the boycott in general, its motivations and its justifications. The State of Israel is in violation of international law. The Second Geneva Convention, countless United Nations resolutions, they have institutionalized and bureaucratized a continuous violation of Palestinian human rights, not to mention civil rights. The State of South Africa has sent a fact-finding mission to the State of Israel and has determined that, yes, there is apartheid inside of Israel regarding its Palestinian citizens. So, to just call the BDS movement anti-Semitic is to deflect the justification for the BDS movement, which a lot of really smart and good people have put a lot of thought and time into considering and have decided to adopt. So, yeah, the BDS movement is not anti-Semitic. It seeks to hold Israel accountable to the people whose human rights it violates every day.
So let's talk a bit about the backlash. Britain, France, and Canada have all taken steps to outlaw BDS. And here in the United States, efforts are currently underway at the federal level and in several states to criminalize BDS organizing. In fact, there's currently a bill to that effect being considered here in the Florida State Legislature.
Yeah, in fact, I think it just passed.
Oh, did it? What is your reaction to this international effort to criminalize BDS? And if you want to speak specifically about the Florida bill, that would be great.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's not a surprise to me. Those Western countries that you just noted all have military ties to Israel and security ties to Israel. And, Western Europe is a market for Israel to sell the weapons that it tests on the human populations in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. And that's how it markets its weaponry to these Western so-called democratic and, progressive countries, is that they've been tested and proven on real people in real situations. We have an exchange program all across the United States in different places, but one that comes to mind is in the state of Georgia. It's called GILLY. It's an exchange between Georgian, police officers from Georgia and police officers from the state of Israel. And they're supposed to teach our cops how to control crowds, as if that's a desirable, way for any law enforcement agency to respond to the citizens that it's supposed to be protecting. So it's no surprise to me that these Western countries and various states around the United States are trying to sort of undermine the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Mm-hmm. In fact, this, and there's a history in state legislatures, for example, in the state of Florida, of continuously affirming the friendly and economically beneficial relationship that it has with the state of Israel. And in fact, a few years ago, there was one line in the resolution in the Florida legislature that not only lauded Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East and as a country that was not an occupying force, but also that it was a country party to the oldest land deed in recorded human history found in the Bible.
Wow.
Promise, yeah. So there are, economic relationships, security and military-industrial relationships, and also there's a religious connection that has, led Western countries and specific states within the United States, including Florida, to really affirm this relationship with Israel and do anything they can to not hear or stymie well-founded criticism of that relationship and of the State of Israel's practices.
Mm-hmm. And so BDS is considered to represent a part of what is widely referred to as the new anti-Semitism, and this is how these efforts to outlaw it are justified. The new anti-Semitism is a concept that developed in the late 20th and early 21st century, and further popularized by Israeli politician and writer Natan Sharansky, who explains it by saying, quote, "Whereas classical anti-Semitism is aimed at the Jewish people or the Jewish religion, new anti-Semitism is aimed at the Jewish state. Since this anti-Semitism can hide behind the veneer of legitimate criticism of Israel, it is more difficult to expose, making the task even harder. Is this hatred is advancing in the name of values most of us would consider unimpeachable, such as human rights." What are your thoughts about this concept of the new anti-Semitism?
Well, I mean, if there was no veneer for critics of Israel to hide behind, then it wouldn't be an issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, boycotts are inherently discriminatory, but they discriminate against those who discriminate. If the state of, in apartheid South Africa, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement there was not anti-European. It was not anti-Christian. It was not anti-white, even though it targeted a government run by and for white Christian Europeans. It was not discriminatory, except in the sense that the South African government itself was discriminating in heinous ways. So, of course, we should discriminate against those who discriminate.
Right.
And if Israel doesn't want to be boycotted, then you've got to remove the veneer of justification that legitimizes the movement. If you don't want to be boycotted, then don't militarily occupy a people for decades, and don't abuse their human rights at every turn. Mm-hmm. If historic anti-Semitism and our gut reaction against it, which is well-founded and should be reacted against, the anti-Semitism we've found in European, Christian, and also Muslim history in different ways, should be reacted against. But it should not be used as a block for speaking truth to Israeli power and supporting Palestinian human rights.
It seems to me that actually legislating against an activist strategy like this is a pretty extreme measure. To your knowledge, have other boycott movements ever inspired that kind of response where politicians actually start passing laws to prevent it? And if not, why do you think in this case that kind of reaction is happening?
Well, I'm not sure exactly about the legislative history surrounding boycott movements, so I'm not sure about that. But the response to, I mean, first of all, the right to boycott is protected political speech under the First Amendment of the Constitution,
right,
which has been upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. So all of these legislative moves to try to undermine citizens and companies' ability to participate in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement are unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. And that's for me a really important bottom line. In the state of Florida, there was legislation. I think it was in 2012, although I can't remember exactly, which sought to punish companies that were doing business with Cuba. But the Supreme Court went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and it said, no, that the right to do business is protected, that the right to withhold business is also protected for citizens and for private companies. But for the state government to say that because of a politically motivated decision, which is protected under the First Amendment, you will no longer have access to state contracts, you will not be considered for partnerships with the state, and you will be put on a blacklist that will be available for all to see, is totally ludicrous.
Yeah. So our challenge is being prepared?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about in the state of Florida is that even though this legislation is unconstitutional, there isn't even a plaintiff that can raise a lawsuit claiming damages based on this legislation. In other words, there are no companies in the state of Florida, to my knowledge. I don't know. I mean, if you know one, I'd love to hear about it. It'd be interesting. But to my knowledge, there are no companies in the state of Florida that boycott or advocate for divestment or for sanctions on Israel. So that begs the second part of your question, which was, where is this reaction against BDS coming from?
Yeah.
And I'm really not sure. I mean, a couple of years ago, in like 2013 or 14, similar pieces of legislation popped up in all these different state legislatures and in the federal government. They were different from the one this year, but they basically were bills outlining what they called, quote, discriminatory boycotts, which, like I said before, I mean, a boycott is inherently discriminatory. You're just discriminating against discriminators, right? Yeah. But, and at that point, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which is a big champion and proponent of this idea of the new anti-Semitism, and AIPAC, both of those institutions did not support that legislation. And you wonder, well, why not? Maybe it's because it was just a trial run to check the temperature of the waters there and see how future legislation could be better positioned. Yeah. Are organizations like AIPAC or the ADL behind this round of legislation? I have no idea. I mean, although I've heard that ADL figures and statistics were used to justify calling BDS anti-Semitic in the Florida state legislature. I am not aware of any official or explicit connection between the ADL and the support for these bills.
It's going to be interesting.
There has been a connection drawn between AIPAC and the bills, though.
Okay.
From what I've heard. From the Peace House video that I think you're familiar with from FSU, they have that campaign, Stop Joe's Bill, and they were talking about how his wife had accepted campaign contributions. I might be wrong, but...
Sure. Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say, is that you have these explicit connections where AIPAC is actually telling people to do stuff, but then you have a sort of self-censorship, or rather than self-censorship, you have an internalized understanding of what is a successful political strategy in the United States. Mm-hmm. So Joe Negron's wife Joe Negron is in the Senate in the Florida legislature, and his wife is running for a seat in the federal Congress. And so it's surmised by Peace House, by the video, and by others, whether or not the fact that his Joe's top legislative priorities this session, one of them was the anti-BDS legislation. Mm-hmm. Could it be that he wants to get good with getting the good graces of the pro-Israel lobby, and thereby, by extension, getting his wife into good graces with that lobby? Like, that clearly sounds like a smart, quote-unquote, tactical thing to do as a legislator. Mm-hmm. It is not politically viable, it seems, in our political climate for elected representatives to really be honest about what's happening in occupied Palestinian territories or how Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel are routinely treated.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have to wonder about how all these different bills pop up in the same time all over the place, and I think that they're all basically the same bills, which makes me think of ALEC.
Yeah,
sure does.
Legislative exchange. So I don't know the answer.
Well, ALEC has membership corporations that probably benefit from activities in Israel and want to protect their profits. So that might be part of it as well.
I would imagine so. But of course, yeah.
Anyway. So we have a few minutes left, and I just want to touch on one more thing. The anti-Semitism issue versus criticism of Israel has been a huge conversation in our local community. When I asked in a meeting that I was in about pure clarification about how to discern, someone had mentioned to me the 3 Ds, which I had never heard about before. I previously mentioned Natan Sharansky, who popularized the new anti-Semitism. He did that by creating what's called the 3 Ds test to determine whether criticism of Israel is fair or if it crosses into being anti-Semitism. The 3 Ds are delegitimization, which means the denial of Jewish self-determination, demonization, meaning conspiracies of Jews owning or having control of the media or other societal institutions, and double standards, which is singling out Israel for similar situations conducted in other countries, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, etc. What are your thoughts on this method of discerning anti-Semitism from legitimate criticism of Israel? And you have 1 minute.
Okay. Well, first of all, Israeli soldiers appear as demons to the Palestinians whose bones they break, whose homes they invade, whose children they arrest and torture and then release into the streets without telling them where their family is, whose homes they demolish, whose lives they make virtually unlivable. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to talk about the demonization of Israel, let's talk about whether or not its actions might lead somebody to demonize Israel. And it's the same with delegitimization. Do I delegitimize Israel when I call it out for what it does? Or does Israel delegitimize itself by enacting these policies and practices and by trying to silence dissent using the mass murder of European Jews and the history of anti-Semitism as its justification for that? Mm-hmm. I think the answer is pretty clear.
Yep. So I'm going to stop you there, and we're going to wrap up. We've been listening to activist with Jewish Voice for Peace, Aaron Ellis. Thank you so much for joining us today, Aaron. Is there any way for listeners to learn more about your work with Jewish Voice for Peace or at FSU as an organizer?
Well, I think that most what people can do is follow some good sources on Facebook or on listservs, including Jewish Voice for Peace. FSU Students for Justice in Palestine. You can find us on Facebook. We have a great cycle of articles. But mostly get involved locally. See who is around you that's talking about these issues, because there probably is somebody, some group, and they probably are in need of or open to expanding their relationships with other organizations and other people who also care about human rights and want to speak truth to power.
All right.
Thanks so much for joining us today.